And you don't have to write it down, but if you do write it down, write it so everybody around you can see it, because then it'll be really fun. Now, I want us all to think of somebody that we either currently have conflict with or recently have had conflict with, because this message will make a lot more sense for all of us if we I guess, view it in the lines of what's actually happening in our lives. All right, so is everybody thinking of somebody right now? Y'all need to participate in class. Okay. Conflict stinks, doesn't it? It's like life can be going so good. This is what happened to me yesterday. Getting ready for the message and watching football. Anybody watch the football games yesterday? And we just had a great day, and it was winding down, and everything was laid out just like I like my day before I preach to be, and I was just feeling good about things. And about 8 o'clock, we put our daughter to bed, and all of a sudden, there was just all this like heated tension between Vanessa and I, and all of the stuff that I think I had been ignoring, maybe her a little bit too. We're trying to sell our house right now, getting ready to move. We have a baby on the way. Vanessa's more than 6 months pregnant. Ingrid is sick. She's got the just crumb. And so they're home today doing that. And so it's like, but my world was in peace. And I was doing good and everything was great. And then all of a sudden we were like, okay, what are we going to do? Because we had a showing today. What are we going to do before we get to the showing? And in my mind, I'm thinking, pick up a little bit of trash and make the bed and leave, right? And in her mind, we're painting the hallway, we're cleaning the garage, we're getting the kitchen spick and span, we're doing the bath, we're vacuuming. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. And so we start debating, right? And she's like, no, but we need to do this. They're going to buy the house if we do this, this, and that. And I'm like, no, we just need to go to bed. We're tired and you're pregnant and come on. And so we get into this like, And then, of course, like, it's easy to say, well, you're always like this. You always want to make it right. And it's easy for me to want to be like, you want to be controlling. And, of course, that's not what you should do in conflict, as you're going to learn today. And so we're just going back and forth. And finally, we're able to resolve it after an hour of valuable painting time wasted, And it's just like, how fitting. Right? Here I go, like, to preach a message on conflict. And I just, we just realized that conflict is difficult. And I think as I was looking at this message, I think conflict is maybe some of the most painful thing that any of us ever experience in life. Really, right? Because usually conflict happens with those closest with us. So it's the relationships we care about most. And then when we get in conflict, it's like you can't go near that person without your whole heart and soul and stomach just churning. You know that feeling? And then it can get worse and worse and worse. And then we can have broken relationships and then estranged relationships. And then, relationships where we're so close and then we never talk again. And out of these things come divorce and, kids that move away. And I mean, all this kind of stuff starts from the same thing for all of us, conflict. And so sometimes we talk about the Old Testament as being hard to understand and then to learn from in our life. I think we're lucky today because today is very relevant. It's very applicable. And I think for all of us, if we can, this is a task, I think, but if we can humble ourselves and surrender ourselves to what I think God teaches us through this passage on how to resolve conflict. We call it reconciliation. That's a fancy word for it. I think we can find a lot of freedom in doing these steps and working through this. So anyway, that's what we're going to do today. And to do that, we're going to tell the story of Jacob. Now, where we're at is Genesis talks about God creating the world and creating the first human beings. And that's Adam and Eve, right? And they grow up and they do some things. It gets pretty bad, bad enough that God is willing to wipe out most of the earth and keep Noah and some of his sons. And so they have the flood, and then Noah comes on the earth, and the same thing sort of happens. And so God starts to call an individual person that he says is going to be a nation. That's Abraham. And so Abraham is the grandfather of Jacob and Esau. And Jacob and Esau are twins, and that's the story that we're going to pick up today. Now, they were born at the same time. They were the first-born sons to Isaac. And so Isaac is Abraham's son. And an interesting thing about Jacob and Esau is they were both around when Abraham was around. They were 15 years old when Abraham died. So they knew of the blessings of Abraham. And if you grow up in a family with great tradition and maybe even wealth, you know the idea of wanting to pass on the family name. And that's what Jacob and Esau were born into. And it was really interesting in that culture how it worked. Instead of, the granddad and then the dad passing on the inheritance equally between all the families, fair, they did it a different way. They gave all the blessing to the firstborn. And the firstborn was the one that was going to carry on everything for them, the firstborn male. And so it was a big deal that Jacob was born minutes after Esau. Even though they were twins, even though they both were sort of the firstborn, because Esau came out first, he gets all the goodies. And so constantly we see this tension between Jacob and Esau start even before they're old enough to realize it. And it's really interesting as you look at their lives. Jacob is the one that's kind of meek and mild, and he's sort of conniving and controlling too. Esau is like aggressive out there. He's a hunter, a killer. He's a real man. And he also causes family lots of trouble. He also doesn't listen and doesn't really want to follow the advice of his parents. And so we see even early in his life, he goes out and has these Canaanite women that he marries and causes his family great problem. And we're not told exactly why, but basically the dad takes sides with Esau, and the mom, Rachel, is it Rachel? Yeah, Rachel takes sides with Jacob. And so we have this almost warring world. And I think probably Rachel didn't like Esau that much because he was, sleeping around with all these women, and he wasn't treating the family promise well, and almost like there was good reason for it. And so what happens is her and Jacob come up with a plan to steal the birthright, to steal that blessing from Isaac, and they do it. He puts fur on his skin, and anyway, he steals it from Isaac. Isaac gives it to him, not knowing, thinking it was Esau. So Esau comes along. What do you think he's going to do? I mean, all his inheritance, all his money has been stolen by Jacob. What's he do? He gets out. I mean, he's a man, right? He gets out his axe, and he starts taking off towards Jacob. I mean, he's ready to kill him. And so Jacob runs, and he runs off into this distant land. He finds some relatives. He ends up finding a wife, finds a couple wives, finds 4 ladies actually, has a bunch of kids, still has the blessing of God. But after he lives in this distant land for a while, he realized that he can't actually live out his calling the way he wants to because he's in a different land, right? It's like inheriting, a key to Grand Junction, but then being forced to move to Denver. What good's a key to Grand Junction, right? And so that's what Jacob is battling with. And so there's 3 things that I want to point out for this conflict that we see. First thing, there's an impossible conflict. Jacob knows if he goes back, he's going to have to fight against Esau. But Esau is a man. Again, he's got hair. This guy is like, you don't want to fight against Esau. But Jacob knows that his promise, his blessing is there. And so what does he do? Well, God finally tells him, I want you to go there. And he's forced with this choice. I don't know if I should go or not, but I think I'm going to die, but okay, I think I'll go. I think it's very relevant for our lives, right? A lot of times when we get in conflict, doesn't it seem that resolution is impossible? Aren't there so many excuses and reasons of why not to go to that person to try to reconcile? Because of all the impossibility, all the things that were said, all the things that are going to be carried out. And that's what Jacob and Esau are working against. The second thing is avoidance. Jacob is the ultimate avoider. I feel very akin to him in this. And it's almost like I don't want to share this in front of everybody, but it's a reality of my life, and I think a lot of people's lives. It's a lot easier to avoid conflict than deal with it. I mean, it's a lot easier to run away when there's things that make us uncomfortable than to hit it head on and to deal with it. And so if you look at Jacob's life, I mean, it's just over and over and over. He's off in the corner, avoiding and controlling, avoiding and conniving, you know? And so he gets manipulated everywhere. And, you know, Jacob thinks that if he avoids one conflict, he can get away and there'll be a brand new world, right? You ever felt that way? Like, well, if I could just leave these stupid people and then I'd go over here and everything would be good, right? And so I'm going to go start new relationships. I just need to get rid of the old ones. And I need to find a new church. And I need to find a new community. And when I get to the new one, then everything will be good, right? And that's what Jacob does. But he goes to this new place, and it's worse. Laban, his now father-in-law, is just brutal to him. I mean, he's taking advantage of him. He's pawning off, you know, daughters of his that aren't likable to him. He's like, oh, now you're married to her. And I mean, he's just brutal to him, stealing from him, and then he's out to kill him and accusing him of stealing, all this kind of stuff. And so Jacob finds that avoidance isn't working very well. And I think for all of us, this is a huge point that I took out of this as I was studying. Avoidance doesn't really work. It's like good at the beginning, and we write excuses of why I don't want to go reconcile, why I should stay away from this situation that's uncomfortable. And if I go there, it's just going to create problems. It's not true. And the cool thing we're going to see through this is the story of the gospel and of Jesus is all about going back to those conflicts, allowing God to reconcile and bring freedom in our lives. And so the third thing we see after avoidance is calling. Jacob had a calling. But his calling was right through this mess. Isn't that how it is sometimes in our life? God calls us to something, but we have to hit head on those things that we're absolutely avoiding and afraid of. And that's what Jacob has to do. Like I said, he's got the key to Canaan, but he's off in some place that I can't pronounce. And so he has to decide, am I willing to go seek my calling, what God has called me to do, but be aware that there's going to be some major problems and God's going to have to come in miraculous ways? Or do I kind of stay back in my own little comfortable world that I'm just constantly regretful, constantly wishing and longing to be there? And so he goes. And you know, hopefully a word to all of us today is that God has a calling for you. As I was worshiping, I was looking over the crowd and I was just, God, show me your heart for everyone here. And I was just overcome by the sense of love and passion for you from God. This church, you individually have a calling from God, and it's wonderful. It's full of freedom, and there's just so much deep purpose in that it's not worth avoiding going there. And it's worth doing whatever you can to get there. And so, anyway, that's where we pick it up. And so Jacob decides to go back, even though he knows all these problems, and he's still the same old Jacob, by the way. And so he goes back, and when he gets close, the first thing he does is he sends out these messengers of his to go almost like prime the pump with Esau. And he's like, okay, just break the news lightly that Jacob's coming back and just see how he reacts, and then run back as quick as you can and tell me. And what's he going to do if Esau's mad? I don't know, but he still thinks, you know, and then, so guess what? His people come back and they say, Esau's coming with 400 of his warriors. And Jacob's like, oh no, you know? And it's like even more impossible. But he's already committed, and he's got his whole family coming, and his herds and his flocks. I mean, you can't just, I guess you could leave all of your wealth if you want to. He can't run anymore. And so he's coming, he starts to connive more. He gets all these gifts, and he puts them in the front, and he says, these are for you. And he starts sending them out towards where Esau is. And then there's these other groups of people. I mean, this is kind of awkward, I feel like, if I was in this company, because he picks the people he likes least, and he puts them out in the front. I mean, they know what he's doing. Like, hey, 400 people are coming to kill us. Here, you go first. And I like you. You on the back. And I mean, that's what he does. And then guess where he's going to be? All the way at the end. Classic control, classic avoider, classic, I just don't want to deal with this. And so he does that. And it's the night before. And it's almost like there's this epic rising of the next day is going to be the meeting between Jacob and Esau and what's going to happen. And guess what happens that night? Bob talked about it last week. He met with God. So he's by himself. They cross the river. He's camping by himself. I'm sure he's just on his knees like, I don't even know what to do. And I think eventually maybe he turns to God, and there's this representation of a man coming. He wrestles with him. But the idea is what he finally does is he surrenders to God. He finally says, okay, God, you're bigger than all of my conflict. You're bigger than all the problems in my life. You're bigger than all these things that I think are impossible. Isn't that a good word for us? Is God bigger than all that stuff for us? I mean, it's really easy to say it in church, but do we believe it in such a way that we're willing to act on it? Jacob finally is willing to act on it. And so the next morning, we pick it up. Here's what happens. So Genesis 33:1. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming with 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two female servants, and he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. Where's he going to go? He divided up his people. He's still doing that, but where does he go? Does he go to the end? He himself went on before them. This is huge. This is huge. Bowing himself to the ground 7 times until they came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children who God has graciously given your servant." And listen to how he speaks to Esau. Then the servants drew near, they and all their children, and they bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And Joseph and Rachel drew near, last of all. And they bowed down. And Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" This is the gifts that he sent out the day before, back when he was in his conniving years. And Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." Again, look at the use of my Lord. He's his brother. To find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself," Jacob said. "No, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then please accept them as a present from my hand. For I've seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you've accepted me." That's big. You know, you ever seen a miraculous transformation happen in somebody? It is like seeing the face of God, because you're like, well, you're supposed to be killing me right now. And now you're accepting me? I mean, this is like, I can't imagine what's happening. "Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him and took it. And he took it. Esau took the gift. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you." But Jacob said, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. They have been driven hard for one day. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass ahead of my servant, and I will slowly lead. At the pace of the livestock are ahead of me, and at the pace of children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." And so Esau says, "Okay, you can do it." And then the biggest thing we see later is that Esau had actually planned to bring these 400 men that Jacob thought were for his harm to bless him, to actually go with him. "Here, I've brought these so that they can accompany you on the way." Quite a transformation, right? What is happening here? How could it be such a drastic contrast? Well, I think we see in Jacob modeled reconciliation for us. So what I want to do is go into 3 points that I think are applicable for us. 3 ways that are not really ways, 3 steps that we can take. Now, 2 things before I jump in. 1, this is not a science. We are not into rules and regulations here. What I'm about to give you is just a vehicle that my hope would be for all of us would promote heart change in ourselves. The second thing is we are talking about conflict here, not abuse. So some of you may have come from abusive relationships or situations. I'm not sure that these principles necessarily apply to you. What we're talking about here is when two people have conflict. We're not talking about when somebody comes and lords themselves over and abuses someone. And if that's you, if you've been abused in some way and you're struggling to work through how to deal with that, I would strongly suggest that you seek some older, wiser counsel. To be honest with, that you're actually willing to be transparent and go to them and say, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what's been done to me, can you help me work through this? Because I think those are very delicate situations in which our mind almost turns very distorted and we can't see in ourselves the right way to act. Okay, so we're talking about conflict, not abuse. Okay, so in conflict, let's talk through what we see here. The first point that we see is Jacob starts with me. That's the first. Start with me. I think this story is very accurately told from the standpoint of Jacob, right? We don't really see what's happening with Esau. All of a sudden, we get to see at the same time that Jacob does that Esau already somehow had this heart change. And again, Esau is portrayed as this beater-upper kind of guy. Thing that came to mind was not appropriate for church. And so what happens to Esau that all of a sudden now he changes in such a way? Well, the point of conflict, what we usually try to do is we start with the other person, right? Tell me this, how many times have you talked to somebody about conflict where you heard that other person tell you, they're lamenting about their conflict in life, where they're like, and then I said this, wasn't that dumb? And then I said this and this and this, and then I did this, right? Maybe sometimes, but usually isn't it, and you'll never believe what they said next. They had the audacity to say that, and it's and then they did this, and then they did this. And so we usually in conflict, even last night with my wife, I'm like, no, I'm supposed to be talking about myself, but she is doing this right now, And because that's what happens in our heart. Our heart changes from this, I see what's going on in me, to how dare you. And we see in Jacob, I think he had a lot of reasons to justify what he did to steal the blessing in the way that he did. Esau's not portrayed as a great guy, right? And so if we have a godly guy and a non-godly guy going to take a blessing from the dad, and of course Jacob sees himself as godly, and Esau's sleeping around with all these women, isn't it fair enough to say that Jacob would say, he doesn't deserve it? I'm actually helping him. I'm doing what I'm supposed to. And then what about the time that he got the blessing, the birthright, by cooking him stew? Those of you that were here in the last weeks, remember this part where he cooks him stew, and Jacob's so famished, he says, I'll give you anything, even my birthright, just give me that stew, right? And so Jacob had plenty of reasons to be excusing himself for his actions. But it's not until he finally owns up to who he is that things start to change. What I want to do is I want to look at what's happening in us when conflict happens. And there's a scripture in James that is so helpful to do that. It's James 4:2. Let's read it. James 4:1 and 2. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? All right, conflict. What causes conflict? Is it not this, that your passions are at war with you? You have desire, but you do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. So here's what's happening with our desires. There's three things that I sort of want to point out. First of all, at the root of conflict is the passions within us. And they're warring, and basically we want something, right? And so these desires, struggling how to get expressed in inappropriate ways, right? That's what happens. And by the way, desires are not bad. Jacob's desire to inherit the blessing and the kingdom of Abraham, I mean, don't we all want that? That's not bad. But when he stole it from Esau, when he justified himself by taking it into his own hands, that's when it became bad. And so these desires, they do three things when they get misused in conflict. The first is they demand, right? He started to demand. He went from I need this to I have to have this, right? That's what happens in our heart in conflict. Usually it starts out with good desires. You know, I want my wife to do something for me. I want her to love me. But then when we make her love me, right? Or you know, in a relationship, maybe with our kids, we want them to grow up to be godly people. But when they don't, we say, you have to be that, and it causes conflict, right? When we turn those good desires into evil, when we have to demand what we get, that's when it becomes a problem. And that's what James says. Is it not this? Your passions are at war with you. You desire, but you don't have. And so what do? You murder. You covet, and you cannot obtain. So you fight and quarrel. Right? This is strong language to be saying when we have to have something, we just get it in our minds, and I have to have that. The second thing is we damn. And Esau didn't deserve the birthright, right? And Laban later was evil, right? And so what happens in our mind, Jacob, he starts to decide. He starts to be the judge and jury for these people. He starts to say, they don't deserve it. Well, whose place is it for them to, for him to say that somebody else doesn't deserve it? Well, I just know. And that's what happens. Later in James, it says this, do not speak evil against one another, brothers. For whoever speaks against another brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's only one judge and lawgiver, he who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? This is what happens in conflict. First, we demand, and then we turn things around on the other person. It's their fault. They did this to me. I know their life. I know everything about them, and they're evil. Right? Isn't that what we do? And we want to raise ourselves to the place of judge in their life. And so we condemn and we point fingers. I mean, I hate to say this, but the reality is this is evil when we do this. When we're in conflict and we speak to somebody else or we speak about them in a judging way, it's evil. It's us saying, I can be God. I know this person. And we don't. We just don't. And then the third thing is we distort. So our evil desires, they demand, I have to have it. They damn, they say it's your fault. And then they distort. And this is very clearly seen in Jacob. He was convinced that all the powers of Esau were going to come and kill him. His whole life was controlled by it. Can you imagine how miserable that trip back to Canaan was for Jacob? I mean, every day, what's he thinking about? 5 days till I die. 4 days till I die, right? I mean, his whole world has become distorted by these desires and conflict. And isn't that what happens to us in conflict? When we're in conflict with somebody, all of a sudden, it's like conflict and these desires become a disease within us. And we can't see clearly. All of a sudden, we're demanding. All of a sudden, we're damning. All of a sudden, we're distorted. We just have no clue of reality. We're in our own little world. And we think whatever is happening in our world is the reality, but it's usually not. There's just one quick story I wanted to share about this, because I think our distortion has huge power to harm other people in our lives. When I was younger, like 8 years ago, I spent a summer in Canada, and I spent we were at an at-risk youth camp with teens that were very high risk. And so usually these teens would be woken up in the middle of the night in their home by policemen who would escort them to the bus station to come up to Canada where we were to have this really rigorous camp to work through some of their issues. And right, it's always the kids' fault, right? I mean, they're the way they are because of them, right? And so as a counselor for this, there was one girl